Hey everybody, welcome back to the Introduction to Watercolor class. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to paint a green apple. In the previous video, I demonstrated painting a red apple using only the primary colors. In this lesson, we will be expanding the palette to include some secondary colors, brown and black. Including these additional hues will help us mix colors more efficiently and achieve greater intensity where we need it. Here's a look at the subject I'm going to be painting today. This is an artificial apple. You can screenshot this image and use it as your source for the painting, or you can use your own green apple or a photo of a green apple. You may want to try to find a photo or arrange your still life with a strong single light source so that you have plenty of value contrast and a cast shadow. Okay, let's get started by taping down our paper, which is 90-pound weight cold press paper. Now let's start the contour drawing. I'm using a 2B graphite pencil. I'll start on the left side of the paper, so I want to estimate the size of my apple and cast shadow and where it needs to be placed on the paper to centrally balance it in the composition. I'll lightly sketch in the general curves, planes, and angles of the apple. After the light sketch, let's add a bit more pressure and emphasize that contour. Now we'll add the edges of the cast shadow, and I want to keep this very light, and the concave opening around the stem and the stem itself. And there we go. Now let's mix our colors. We're going to mix 4 colors for this painting. We want to keep things as simple as we can for most of the projects in this first series of lessons. First, we'll mix our lightest color to paint around the highlights. I think I'll keep this practically all yellow. There may be a touch of green in it, maybe from stains around the edge of the pan, but it's pretty much all yellow. The next color is mostly yellow with some green added. We'll use this for those light middle values that cover most of the apple. Be sure to go easy on the green as you mix this one, otherwise the green can easily dominate the yellow. The third color we'll mix is a general shadow color for the apple. We'll use green with a little red added to darken and lower the intensity of the green. Also, we want less water and more pigment in this mixture. Just add little amounts of red until you get the right mix for a shadow green. If it turns to mud, you know you added too much red. Remember that red is the complement of green on the color wheel. That's why it works to make it darker and more neutral. Last, we need a very dark green for the darkest areas of shadow on the form of the apple. For this, we'll use even less water and less green and more red mixed in. The most important thing for this color is that it's dark. Now let's test them out on a piece of scrap paper. These look pretty good to me. A nice range in value and temperature from light to dark and warm to cool. Okay, I'm eager to paint. We're going to be working very quickly with this today. We don't want our paint to dry while we're blending colors together. Let's start with the lightest color. We want to leave an area of white for the highlight on the upper left, so we'll carefully go around that. Now let's go around the highlights we see around the stem of the apple in that indentation. I'll leave a little wedge shape there for the highlight and the stem which overlaps it. Now we'll add in our next darker color and begin filling in more of the apple in the center and top right edge. I'm working quickly so it doesn't dry. I left a little gap under the stem. I'll touch that with yellow that I can see in there. Let's soften some of the edges of our highlights now. The main highlight and near the stem. I see some areas where I need a slightly darker version of this yellow-green, so I'll quickly mix some with a little less water in it. Let's add that in the center, the upper right edge, in the left side near the stem, a touch on the bottom left edge, and now we'll fill in the rest of the apple, except where our core shadow is. Now let's get our shadow green color. I'll add some on that edge, the core shadow, and now I'm using some linear hatched lines for shadow and texture or pattern that I see. That will bleed and blend into the other color. We'll dab some just next to the stem on the left. And a few other spots that I see. Let's add more into the core shadow. Okay, we'll clean the brush and soften and even lift out a little along the bottom right for the reflected light. Now we'll get our darkest shadow color. I see some of that along the top right edge, and I'll bring that down into the core shadow. Notice this is still wet, so it's blending nicely. I'll put some of that along the bottom as well. There's not much pattern on the fake apple I'm using as a source. You can leave it without pattern if you want, but I'll add some to mine. I'm applying some linear strokes and dabs into the shadow area and near the stem. There's a little cast shadow to the right of the stem we'll add. At this point the apple is still damp, but it's getting drier. Now I'm going to add a lighter green color and add some pattern in those lighter areas. These are cross contour strokes I'm adding. You notice how they follow around the form of the apple. The amount of texture you add is up to your preference or how much you see on the apple you're painting. Yours might be different than mine. Let's add more dark color into that core shadow to make it even more three-dimensional. And some more next to the stem. Speaking of which, let's paint that now. We'll clean off the palette and mix two colors for the stem using a mixture of blue and brown. This lighter color is mostly brown with some blue added. This will have slightly more water than our other darker color. The dark color is blue and brown in more equal amounts. Maybe a bit more blue than brown, and less water added. Let's see how these look. Those will work nicely. We'll add the lighter brown color to the right side of the stem, leaving a tiny white highlight on the left side and top of it. Now we'll add the dark color at the bottom, just under the top, and along the right side of the stem. Let's add a touch more for shadow right at the bottom. I like the look of that so far. Let's add the cast shadow now. Since I'm using a combination of blue and brown for my shadow colors, I'm just going to add to the puddles I already have on the palette. I'm mixing them a little out of order here. So let me mix these colors first, then I'll break down the colors and amounts of water for each of them. So these are all a mixture of blue and brown in almost equal amounts. Really the only difference is the amount of water. The top color is the darkest with the least amount of water, so it has an almost milky consistency. The next color is a middle gray value with a little more water added in it. The bottom color is light gray with more water added to our blue-brown mixture. We'll start with the middle gray and carefully go around the bottom edge of the apple. I'll take some time to shape that edge and fill in toward the right of the cast shadow, but not the whole way across. Now we'll take the light gray and add more to the right side of the shadow and finish the shape. Next we'll get a clean, semi-wet brush and soften the outer edge of the cast shadow to create that slight blurry edge. Let's get the darkest color out now and add it just along the edge of the apple and drag and blend it into the middle of the cast shadow. We'll just let that bleed and blend into the previous color. One more thing I want to do is just soften the edge a little between the apple and the cast shadow so it's not so hard edged. For some added depth, let's take this darkest color that's almost black and add it into that recessed bottom of the core or indentation at the top. And a stroke along the right edge of the stem. I'm going to soften the right edge of that cast shadow just a little more. Let's stop for a minute here. So this could be a finished painting right now and it would be just fine. But I'm going to add more surface pattern and darken some of the shadows more, just to show you how we can take this painting a little further if we want to. So let's clean off the palette. We'll mix some yellow-green again. This time we'll mute it just a little bit with orange instead of red. It has a similar effect as adding red. Now I'm adding more vertical cross-contour strokes to give it some subtle texture. I start in the dark areas first and work toward the lighter areas of the apple. If you don't want this much texture and like your results up to this point, that's perfectly fine. I'm just adding a little bit more for fun. I'll lighten a few of those dabs near the highlight with my brush where I got it a little too dark. Adding this surface pattern is a good way to practice your brush handling and get a feel for the balance of pigment to water in your paint mixtures. Now we'll mix a darker green with some orange added and less water for some texture in the shadow areas. Let's dab that into the core shadow. We're really just shading here as well as adding texture. Okay, let's clean the brush, dry it a little, and soften the edges of the texture so it's more subtle. Now we'll mix some of that with our lighter color and a little more water and drag that into the reflected light. And up near the stem. One last thing I'd like to do is mix more dark cast shadow color with blue and brown and add it next to the bottom of the apple. And I'll drag it toward the center. And soften and blend into the rest of the shadow. We can add some water to that color to lighten it and use it to soften the edge as well so that it's more of a gradual transition. I'll clean off my brush and soften that a little more. Let's stop there and compare and take a look at the results. So here I have the previous one before I added the texture, and then the results now after adding texture. I'm not sure if I like it any better with the added texture. It kind of looks like a furry green apple. But I think I maybe like it a little better with that texture. It adds something to it. I like it enough to sign it at least. So feel free to experiment with things like pattern and texture. That's one of the purposes of these lessons, is to practice our mixing, blending, and brush handling skills. That's all I have for you in this video. I hope you had fun, success, and that you'll join me again for the next video lesson very soon. Thanks for watching.